Welcome to Fierce Queen's Reckoning. I'm glad you're here. Let's get into the story. When Tobias Wren pulled his leased Cayenne up to the curb outside a weathered Victorian on the edge of Hamilton's lower city, he had one goal: humiliate his ex-wife into signing over the last thing standing between him and a $4 million publishing deal. New girlfriend, Kendall, 26, a lifestyle influencer with a ring-light tan and freshly laminated brows, specifically to witness the moment. He had a certified check for $30,000 in his breast pocket, drawn from the advance he'd already spent twice over. He was fully expecting to find Petra Wren. Sorry, Petra Novak again. She'd gone back to her maiden name the week the ink dried, living exactly the way he'd convinced himself she must be living. Quietly falling apart, struggling. Finally understanding what she'd lost when she let him go. What he was not expecting was what was actually behind that door. Chapter 1. The Man Who Confused Noise for Power. Tobias was 49. He had the kind of face that had once been handsome enough to open doors. Strong jaw, thick dark hair now silvering at the temples, eyes that worked overtime compensating for a mediocre mind. He was a book packager, not an author, not a publisher. A packager, the middleman who assembles other people's concepts, licenses the intellectual framework, and sells the whole thing upstream to a real publishing house, as though it were his own idea. He'd been doing it for 15 years. Living inside the gap between what he created and what he claimed to create, and he had become very comfortable in that gap. He had met Petra 11 years ago at a literary festival in Toronto. She was 30, speaking on a panel about intellectual property in the digital age. She had a mind like a surgical instrument, precise, calm, capable of cutting through noise with a single question. She was not a flashy woman. She wore her dark hair pulled back without apology. She preferred linen to silk, tea to cocktails, and the kind of silence that meant she was actually thinking, rather than the kind that meant she had nothing to say. Tobias had been dazzled by her brain and completely unprepared for what it would eventually do to his ego. For 6 years they had been a team. Petra had quietly built the conceptual and legal architecture of nearly every major deal Tobias closed during their marriage. She designed the licensing agreements. She identified the IP gaps that other packagers missed. She developed the framework, a proprietary content structuring model she called the Meridian system that Tobias used to pitch to publishers. It was elegant, replicable, and entirely hers. He had never once asked her to put her name on it because she hadn't insisted, and because it suited him perfectly that she didn't. When the marriage ended 3 years ago, Tobias had been the one to leave. He had decided, somewhere around his 46th birthday, that Petra's quietness was actually a lack of ambition. That her refusal to work a room at industry events was holding him back. That Kendall, whom he'd met at a Yorkville launch party, represented the kind of visible, energetic partnership that his brand required. He had hired a decent family lawyer, moved fast, and settled before Petra could engage anyone serious. She'd walked away with the house, this house, the old Victorian on Cannon Street, that they'd bought as a project and never quite finished. A modest lump sum. And as far as Tobias was concerned, nothing else of consequence. He had not read the licensing addendum buried in the original partnership documents. His lawyer had flagged it as standard boilerplate. Neither of them had understood what it actually said. Kendall stepped out of the Cayenne carefully, her white sneakers hitting the cracked sidewalk with visible reluctance. She pulled her puffer jacket tighter and looked up at the house with the expression of someone who had accidentally clicked on a very depressing documentary. "Babe," Kendall said, adjusting her crossbody bag. "Is the porch always like that, or did something happen to it?" The front porch of the Victorian was indeed rough. The original wood railing was partially stripped, and several boards showed obvious signs of work in progress. Protective film on the windows, painter's tape along the trim, a tarp folded neatly at the far end. It looked at first glance like a house mid-renovation and possibly losing the battle. "It's a money pit," Tobias said with quiet satisfaction, straightening his jacket. She got the house and absolutely nothing else she needed to maintain it. Come on. He walked up the front path, feeling the particular pleasure of a man who believes he already knows exactly how a scene is going to unfold. He rang the bell. Chapter 2. The door that changed everything. There was a pause. Not a rushed, nervous pause, but a deliberate one. The pause of someone who had absolutely nothing to prove about how quickly they answered their own front door. Then the door opened. Petra Novak was 41, and she looked, and this was the word that surfaced involuntarily and immediately in Tobias's mind before he could suppress it, settled. She wore a simple dark merino crewneck and wide-leg trousers in a warm caramel wool. No jewelry except for a single thin gold band on her right hand, the kind that cost either nothing or an appalling amount, depending entirely on who made it. Her dark hair was down, slightly wavy, and she looked at Tobias with the expression of a woman who had accurately predicted this exact visit approximately 6 weeks in advance. "Tobias," she said. Her voice was exactly as he remembered it. Quiet, precise, unhurried. "I wondered when this would happen." Her eyes moved to Kendall. Not unkindly. Petra was constitutionally incapable of the kind of performative cruelty that required an audience, but with a calm, thorough assessment that lasted roughly 3 seconds and concluded without comment. "This is Kendall," Tobias said, placing his hand at the small of Kendall's back in a way that was more territorial than affectionate. "We're engaged. Congratulations," Petra said, in a tone that was neither warm nor cold, simply accurate. "Can we come in?" Tobias asked, lifting the leather portfolio tucked under his arm. "I have something that needs your attention. Shouldn't take long." Petra stepped back from the door and held it open. "Of course," she said. "Mind the entryway. The original mosaic tile is being restored. The grout work is delicate." Tobias walked in. Kendall followed, both of them, moving down a narrow vestibule, with exposed, plaster walls and dim lighting. A single vintage-style pendant casting warm amber light over bare lath and careful pencil markings on the wall, where something was clearly being planned. And then they turned the corner into the main body of the house. Tobias stopped walking. The house had been gutted and rebuilt behind its original skin. What had once been a cramped, dim Victorian interior was now a single vast open-plan space with 10-foot ceilings, restored original plaster cornicing intact above exposed brick that had been painstakingly cleaned and sealed. The floors were wide plank pine. Not new wide plank pine mimicking heritage aesthetic, but genuinely original boards were finished to a soft, honeyed glow. At the back, a wall of glass French doors opened onto a deep city lot that had been transformed into a walled garden. Raised cedar beds, a small greenhouse in the far corner, 2 old apple trees strung with soft Edison lights still visible in the October afternoon. The furniture was the kind that cost a specific and staggering amount precisely because it looked like it cost nothing. A long linen sofa in warm stone, a wishbone rocker by the window, shelving built into the original alcoves, floor to ceiling, packed with books, real books, cracked spines stacked sideways used. A long harvest table that appeared to be a single slab of live-edge maple ran down the center of the kitchen space, surrounded by mismatched but clearly deliberate chairs. On the wall above the original fireplace, restored, working, currently doing its job, hung a painting that Tobias recognized with a specific, unpleasant jolt. He had tried to buy that painting at Heffel 3 years ago. He had dropped out of the bidding at $65,000. The anonymous buyer who had won it had paid $82,000. "Petra," Tobias said, and his voice had already lost something, some upper register of confidence. When did you?" "Sit down," Petra said simply, moving to the kitchen space and filling a copper kettle at the deep farmhouse sink. "I'll make tea." Kendall was standing very still by the harvest table, running one hand lightly along the surface, the way a person does when they're trying to determine whether something is real. Her eyes kept drifting to the painting. She had an account she'd been building for 2 years, on a platform dedicated to aesthetic interiors. She knew what she was looking at. She just couldn't reconcile it with the neighborhood. With the porch, with the version of this woman Tobias had described to her. "I don't want tea," Tobias said, placing his leather portfolio on the end of the harvest table and unzipping it. "I need to talk to you about the meridian system." Petra set the kettle on the stove. "I know," she said. Chapter 3. The cheque that revealed everything. Tobias pulled a thick sheaf of papers from the portfolio and a slim, expensive pen, matte black. The kind of pen men like Tobias carry to signal that the signing of documents is a thing they do regularly and casually. He also pulled a certified check and placed it face up on the maple table. $30,000. "I want you to know," Tobias said, settling into one of the mismatched chairs without being invited to do so, "that I am not obligated to offer you anything. The meridian system was developed during our marriage, which under Ontario law means it's joint marital property. Property you already received fair settlement for." Petra poured hot water over a small clay teapot and set it on the table in front of herself without offering anything to either of her guests. However, Tobias continued, sliding the check across the table toward her. "Because I am not a vindictive person, and because I understand the renovation must have stretched your resources, I'm offering you $30,000 in consideration for a clean assignment of any and all remaining claims to the Meridian licensing framework. Sign today, and we close this cleanly." Petra looked at the check. She did not touch it. "A clean assignment," she said. "Straightforward," Tobias said. "This is a formality. The Meridian system is part of the Wren Creative portfolio now. We're closing the HarperCollins deal next month. The contract specifically requires that all underlying intellectual frameworks are unencumbered. I need your signature." Kendall, who had been lingering near the shelves pretending to look at book spines, turned around. She walked over, picked up the check from the table, and held it out toward Petra with the kind of careless authority that belongs to people who have never had to be precise about money because there has always been more of it. "It's really generous," Kendall said, smiling with her whole mouth and not very much else. "Tobias has been so fair through all of this. Honestly, some of the girls in my comments section would say you should just be grateful he's offering anything. You could take this, freshen up the porch, maybe do something about the neighborhood vibe." She glanced toward the French doors. "Actually, the garden is really cute. You could do a lot with this space. It photographs well." Petra looked at Kendall for a moment, not with contempt, with something that was, if anything, more unsettling. The patient, slightly mournful look of a woman watching someone young and bright walk toward a door that only opens from the outside. "Thank you, Kendall," Petra said with a quietness that made the words land like stones. Then she turned to Tobias. "The Meridian system is not joint marital property," Petra said. Tobias exhaled through his nose. The exhale of a man exercising patience with someone he has decided in advance is wrong. "Petra, the Meridian system," Petra continued, her voice carrying the same unhurried precision it always had, the precision that had built his career and that he had systematically mistaken for accommodation, "was conceptually developed and formally documented by me in the 18 months before our wedding. I filed a copyright registration for the framework under my own name, Petra Novik, in March of 2012. We were not married until September of 2013. The kitchen was very quiet. The copper kettle ticked softly as the water inside it cooled. That's not," Tobias started. "When we began working together, Petra said you used the Meridian system under an informal licensing understanding. There was never a formal assignment of ownership. You never asked for one, because you didn't know what you were looking at. You thought it was a methodology, a habit of mine. You didn't understand that it was a discrete, documented, protected framework." She poured tea into her cup. "Your publishing contracts have been built on a licensed tool, a license that exists under my name, not yours, and that I have the right to revoke." Tobias's jaw tightened. "You're telling me you can blow up the HarperCollins deal?" "I'm telling you," Petra said, setting the teapot down with a soft, conclusive sound, "that I already have." Chapter 4. The call that confirmed it. Tobias's hand was already moving toward his phone. The same hand that had slid the check across the table 60 seconds ago, certain of its power, now trembling with the first flutter of genuine fear. He called his agent. Jeff Mandrell, 20 years in the business, the kind of agent who returned calls within the hour and texted you happy birthday every year without being asked. The call connected on the second ring. "Tobias." Jeff's voice was flat, in a way it had never been in 20 years. "Geoff, I'm with Petra right now. She's claiming the Meridian system is registered under her name from before the marriage. Tell me this is something we can work around. Tell me the HarperCollins contract still stands." There was a silence that lasted exactly long enough for Tobias to understand that the answer was not going to be the one he needed. "We got an email from their legal team this morning," Jeff said. "They did a routine IP verification before finalizing the schedule. Petra's registration came up in the search. They've paused the deal pending clarification of ownership." "Repaused," Tobias repeated. "Tobias, paused is the polite word." Jeff exhaled. "They called me at 8:30 this morning. Their editor is furious. The whole pitch was structured around the Meridian framework being proprietary to Wren Creative. If it isn't, if the underlying system belongs to someone outside the contract, they're not just pausing. They're looking at whether they can claim misrepresentation." Kendall had stopped moving near the shelves. She was standing very still, her crossbody bag clutched against her stomach, her eyes fixed on Tobias's face with an expression that was shifting, in real time, from solidarity to calculation. "Fix it," Tobias said into the phone, his voice losing its shape. "Buy it from her. Offer her whatever she needs. 100,000. I'll find the money." There was another silence. "Tobias," Jeff said carefully, "I called Petra's solicitor this morning. To try to do exactly that. Tobias went still. Her solicitor told me the framework is not available for sale to Ren Creative under any circumstances. Jeff paused. But they did say Petra has already entered into a separate conversation with HarperCollins directly. The room tilted. What did you just say? Tobias said. Not a question. The words came out in a single flat line. HarperCollins reached out to her after the IP flag came back, Jeff said. They want the system. They've always wanted the system. You were the vehicle, Tobias. I'm sorry. I don't know how else to say this. Tobias looked at Petra. She was sitting with her hands wrapped around her teacup, her face entirely composed, watching him with the steady attention of someone who has seen this moment clearly for years and feels no particular need to celebrate it now that it has arrived. You planned this, Tobias said. I documented my work, Petra said simply. I protected what was mine. The planning you're referring to is called preparation. You let me build on your foundation for 11 years and you waited. I waited, Petra agreed, because 3 years ago, the Meridian system was licensed to a portfolio worth $200,000 a year. Today, structured into the right publishing agreement, it's worth substantially more. Destroying you then would have been a waste of good architecture. Tobias stared at her. The man who had parked a leased Porsche outside her house to demonstrate his elevation above her. The man who had brought his young fiancée to witness the humiliation of a woman he had decided was behind him. He stared at her and understood, in a way that would take him years to fully metabolize, that he had never been ahead of her at all. He had simply been walking through a corridor she had built, and had, until this afternoon, assumed he owned. I'll contest it, he said, but his voice had no backbone left. My lawyers will argue the system evolved during the marriage, that it changed substantially enough to constitute joint creation. Petra reached into the pocket of her trousers and set her phone on the table, screen up. You're welcome to, she said. But before you brief anyone, I'd like you to read the email that came through at 10 this morning. Chapter 5. The architecture of the deal. Tobias did not want to look at the phone. He looked at it anyway. The email was from the VP of Acquisitions at HarperCollins Canada. It was addressed to Petra Novak, founder, Meridian Creative Consulting. The subject line read, Offer of Agreement, Meridian Licensing Partnership and Consulting Engagement. Tobias read it slowly, because his brain was insisting on rereading each line twice, hoping the meaning would change on the second pass. It did not change. HarperCollins was not buying the Meridian system outright. They were entering a licensing and consulting partnership directly with Petra, which would give them structured access to the framework across their nonfiction imprint for an initial term of 5 years, with renewal options, in exchange for a licensing fee and a consulting retainer. The retainer alone was more than Tobias had netted from his last 3 book packages combined. Petra would retain full ownership of the IP and would be credited as the framework's originator in all internal documentation and, where applicable, in published materials. At the bottom of the email, a second paragraph. A follow-up from the editor, who had been assigned to the deal Tobias thought was his. Petra, we're so relieved the flag came up when it did. Honestly, after speaking with you this morning, we're genuinely excited about what this looks like with you directly involved. Looking forward to the call Thursday. Tobias set the phone down. He did not slide it back across the table. He simply opened his hand and let it rest there between them, face up, the words still glowing. They reached out to you, he said. His voice was very quiet now. The morning after their legal team found the registration, Petra said. Yes, they went around me. They went to the person who owned what they needed, Petra said. That's not personal, Tobias. That's just how business works. You've said so yourself, many times. Kendall made a sound. Not a word, a sound. The kind of small, involuntary noise a person makes when a very large piece of information lands somewhere in their chest, and they don't have the architecture yet to process it. She was looking at Petra's house differently now, not like a content creator assessing a space, like a person trying to figure out how they had come to be standing in the wrong room. Babe, Kendall said, turning to Tobias. Her voice had a new quality in it. Not panic yet, but the careful precursor to panic, the tone of a person doing rapid, private arithmetic. The Yorkville apartment, the lease renewal. You said the HarperCollins advance was going to cover. Not now, Kendall, Tobias said. The deposit on the venue in Muskoka, Kendall continued, because she had started the arithmetic now, and she could not stop it. My brand partnership is contingent on the engagement announcement. I can't postpone that again. The contract has a deadline. Kendall. His voice cracked on the second syllable. Kendall stopped talking. She looked at him. Then she looked at the room around her. The painting above the fireplace, the walled garden beyond the glass, the long maple table, the copper kettle, the quiet, settled woman who had been systematically misrepresented to her for 2 years as a cautionary tale. Kendall was young, but she was not unintelligent, and the picture assembling itself in front of her was not one she had anticipated. "Is the advance gone?" Kendall asked, quietly. Tobias did not answer. "Tobias, is the advance already spent?" The silence said everything. The silence always says when the answer is yes, and the person who should give it can't. Kendall unhooked her crossbody bag from her shoulder, held it for a moment, and then set it down gently on the maple table. She pulled out her phone, opened it, and began scrolling through something. Her face was completely still in the way that faces go still when a person is making a decision they will not unmake. "I'm going to call my sister," Kendall said, with the eerie calm of someone stepping out of a burning building at the exact moment they understand that the building is on fire and that it is not, in fact, their building. "She's in Oakville. I'll take the go." "I need a minute," she said, and walked toward the front vestibule, already pressing her phone to her ear. Her footsteps faded down the mosaic tile. Tobias turned back to Petra. He was still sitting at her harvest table. His leather portfolio lay open in front of him, the unsigned documents fanned out beneath the certified check, the matte pen resting diagonally across the pile. It looked, in this context, like the aftermath of something rather than the beginning of it. "I built your career," Tobias said. His voice was not angry. It had moved past angry into something rawer, the bewildered, slightly feverish tone of a person realizing that the story they have been telling about themselves for years is factually wrong. "I took your work and I made it visible. I got it in front of the right people. That has to count for something." "It counted for something," Petra said. "It counted for a 6-year marriage, a modest settlement, and a house I've spent 3 years turning into something I actually want to live in." She met his eyes. "I'm not saying you contributed nothing. I'm saying you contributed significantly less than you were credited for, and that the imbalance was always going to correct itself eventually. I simply made sure I was ready when it did." Tobias looked down at the unsigned papers, then at the check, $30,000, which he had meant as a final act of magnanimous condescension, which now sat on Petra Novak's maple table, looking exactly like what it was. Not an offer, but an exposure. Proof of how little he had understood about what he was dealing with. His hand moved toward it slowly. He picked it up. He did not meet her eyes. "My solicitor will be in touch," he said, with the last scrap of professional composure he had available. "Of course," Petra said. Chapter 6. The House That Won. The front door closed behind Tobias Wren with a sound that was, and Petra was aware this was not an architectural feature, but simply the reality of a well-restored 1890s oak door on a solid, freshly re-squared frame, deeply, satisfyingly solid. Not a slam. A conclusion. Petra sat for a moment at the table. She listened to the particular silence of a house after difficult people have left it. It was a different quality of silence from the ordinary quiet of the place. It was the silence of a room reasserting itself. She picked up the documents Tobias had left. He had taken the check but left the papers, which told her something about the state of his thinking, and set them neatly aside. Her solicitor had a copy of everything. There was nothing in those pages that required urgency. There was nothing in any of this that required urgency anymore. She took her teacup to the window and stood looking out at the garden. The October light was doing something beautiful to the apple trees. That low, amber, end-of-afternoon thing that only happens for a few weeks in Ontario, and that she had come to think of as one of the genuine privileges of living in this city, in this neighborhood, in this particular house that everyone had told her she couldn't afford to fix, and that she had very quietly fixed. She thought about the morning 3 years ago when she had moved back in alone. The house had been cold. The kitchen had been unfinished. 2 of the upstairs windows had been cracked, and the garden had been a rectangle of dead grass and broken concrete. She had walked through every room with a cup of tea and a notepad, and she had written down exactly what needed to happen, in what order, and what it would cost, and how long it would take. Then she had set the notepad on the kitchen counter and gotten to work. She had done the same thing with the Meridian system the morning after the divorce was finalized. She had pulled up the original copyright registration, reviewed the licensing addendum in the old partnership documents, called her solicitor, and begun the process of building what came next. Not with anger. Anger was expensive and imprecise. With method, Her phone lit up on the kitchen island. A message from her solicitor. Spoke with HC's legal team. Thursday call confirmed. They're very enthusiastic, Petra. I think this is going to be a good one. She typed back, "Thank you, Sandra. I'll be ready." She locked the phone and set it back down. From the front of the house, very faintly, she heard the sound of a car starting. The particular high-performance sound of a vehicle that announces itself as a status object and in doing so, reveals exactly how much the driver needs to be seen. She heard it pull away from the curb. She heard it fade north on Cannon Street and then disappear entirely into the ambient sound of the city. She turned back to the window in the garden. The apple trees were still doing what apple trees do in October, which is stand in golden light and not require anything from anyone. Petra finished her tea. She rinsed the cup at the farmhouse sink, dried it with a linen cloth, and set it back on the shelf with the others. Then she pulled on her work boots from the hook by the glass doors, unlocked the latch, and stepped out into the garden. She had been meaning to get the last of the raised beds covered before the frost, and she had at least another hour of light. She picked up her garden fork from where it leaned against the cedar bed, felt the weight of it settle in her hands, and got back to work. The ghost in the framework had been named, the license had been reclaimed, and the house that was supposed to represent everything she had lost was, as it turned out, exactly what she had always known it to be. The foundation she had quietly been building her life on, one careful layer at a time, while no one who thought they knew her was paying any attention at all.